we're having here a panel, and one way or another, everybody, one way or another, has been to an extremely large extent or a little bit extent involved in work around Ethiopia, around some of these industrial parks. So it's actually wonderful to be able to do it. So I'm not going to give you a very detailed round of introductions for most, because there is, of course, on the app, you will see details about everybody. But just to be clear, of course, Max Duncan here is the filmmaker. So, you know what? I think they deserve an applause. And it's great we can have Max here, but it's also wonderful to be able to have Professor Arkebe here. He's now a SOAS professor, but many of you, at least some of you in the room, will know that he was essentially the key architect of industrial parks and policies in Ethiopia. So this is obviously the right person to comment and to discuss anything that's around it. And I'm also very grateful to have two of my colleagues here. Stefano Caria is here, professor now with us since this year, and it's also done quite a lot of research in Ethiopia on labor market issues, including in industrial parks. And then Pramila Krishnan, also a professor here in Oxford, and long-time research also on Ethiopia, but also is working on quite related issues in India now, migrants that go to, rural migrants coming to this kind of factories as well. So we could maybe get a little bit of a broader perspective on this as well. Let's go to the panel a bit. And I just can't help just to asking Max a bit like, why, why did you want to make a film like this? But also, what were your priors? We are researchers, we have priors. What were your priors, and to what extent did you maybe get other things than you expected to get when you started making this film?
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. And also, I mean, to have Dr. Arkebe on the panel is quite a thing. No pressure at all. So yeah, my background was I was in China for 10 years. I was a video journalist for Reuters news agency, and then I went freelance and worked 2 years more making documentary. And I think the thing that unified kind of a lot of the work that I was doing in China was about industrialization, urbanization, and the human impact of that. And I always found it fascinating to, we had this huge country, these extraordinary sort of growth figures, all of this data, but what did it actually look like on the ground for the people who were impacted? And this was also, I was there from 2006 to 2016. This is also the time that China ramped up investment in Africa, well, in the global south in general, but Africa in particular. And I had traveled to Ethiopia for tourism, also for work, and it's an extraordinary country, fascinating. And this was a time when, not only was there a lot of Chinese investment in Ethiopia, but also Ethiopia was growing so fast, and they were on this sort of developmental model, which in many ways was quite similar to China's or the East Asian tigers. So much so that people were sort of talking about the China of Africa, which is a very trite name, but in some ways it was, apt. So I essentially went out with the idea of initially with the idea of saying, well, what does this really look like? What does this kind of a developmental model look like in a country that's so different to China? Is there a way of showing this within a kind of microcosm where we can tell this through human stories rather than data analysis, whatever? And so, looked at big infrastructure, looked at private Chinese companies, looked at all kinds of stuff. And there was just on this initial research trip that I went on, it was just such a diversity of Chinese investment and different impacts that it had, and settled on this one industrial park, which just seemed like the perfect microcosm. You have sort of everything there. So I teamed up with Xinyan Yu, who is the co-director, co-producer of the film, who's Chinese from Wuhan. She'd worked at the BBC before. We had worked on a couple of things together, and we started developing the project together. I think in terms of what our expectations were, I think we were, as I've just described, I think our initial interest was sort of what does this particular developmental model look like in Africa, and what is the impact? I think what surprised us was, in a way, how we started the film in 2018. 2019, Abbey had come in 2018, and I think what we witnessed was actually a shift in many ways, a transition from very much the developmental state into perhaps a state which is a government both at the senior level, but certainly at the local level that we found was perhaps less concerned with development in the way that it had been seen before under Mellers and co. So, and I think you see that reflected in many ways in the film with some of the issues that they come across, that perhaps the priorities shifted, and I think that affected many of the things we saw. I mean, let alone COVID and the Civil War and everything else, which were these huge things that flew into our narrative in a way that we didn't anticipate. But I think that was the kind of major thing where we found a lot of unexpected things we didn't expect to see. Yeah.
And can I just quickly ask, have you been back since making the film? Like, you have a sense of what's going on now?
Yeah, I mean, we went back in May for our Ethiopia premiere, which was really interesting. So we had 3 screenings at a festival, the Addis International Film Festival last May, and it was beautiful because we had all of our protagonists. We had Moto, Betty, Wakanesh, also Edie, the translator character, Robot, Wakanesh's daughter, and our Ethiopian field producers all on stage together with big audiences, and answering some pretty tough questions as well. So that was really interesting to have that kind of engagement. We managed to also do a private screening where we had 15 or so reps from the Chinese embassy come and see the film, which they would never come in a public setting, but we managed to do a private setting where someone that would come along and have a little discussion. So that was really interesting, and we're always in touch with Moto, Betty, and Wakanesh. So we kind of keep up to date on what's happening. I mean, nothing more has happened with phase 2. It doesn't look like anything's going to happen very soon. Betty's still working there. She's still in a factory in the EIZ. Moto's doing all sorts of stuff. She got a pilot's license. She climbed Kilimanjaro for the 3rd time. She started a coffee business. She does some work still at the industrial park. She does all sorts of stuff. And Wakanesh and her family are still on their land.
Very good.
So there you go.
Well, thank you, Max. Look, Arkebe, if I may, you've seen this from going back for well before 2018, of course, and followed it. When you see a film like this, what are your reflections? What are, and how does it fit with your experiences and ideas around it in general? So just your general reactions would be welcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much. First, let me. It is okay. It is okay. Yeah. Let me congratulate Max for doing a very interesting and excellent film. The reason I say is this is a film about transformation. It's about industrialization. And capturing this is not quite easy. You could produce the best novel-based movie, bestseller, high-ranking, but in order to prepare such a movie, you need to have a good understanding of development. And in this case, I'm sure the financiers or who provided fund are not from China. But the company here is in play, the park developer is from China. And at a time when a lot of ideology, geopolitics is overriding, this film tries to bring in the story is quite helpful. So when I look at the film, like all films, especially based on a story design, not documentary exactly, there will be some bias or subjectivity here and there. So there can never be any film. If we look after World War II films about Nazism, about American winning or Churchill, they have all element of bias. So we can only say, is it limited? Is it balanced? That's what we can see. And I have to honestly say, I find it very, very balanced. The story is not fabricated. Having said this, I want to bring you also one point, because someone who saw this film will assume Also because the lady, the star, tries to say every building is made by Chinese, etc., it might give the wrong picture. And I have to tell you that the Ethiopian approach on attracting FDI has not been focused or solely on Chinese. I'm saying this because I know almost all FDI firms who came and invested in Ethiopia. I have been a key person in convincing them, bringing them. So let me start with 2005. 2002, Ethiopia came with a very articulated industrial policy. We call it Industrial Development Strategy, IDS. And before that, 1994, Ethiopia adopted ADLI, Agricultural Development-Led Industrialization, which I, in a publication on Ethiopia's Oxford Handbook of Ethiopian Handbook, Doug and Stefan brought a chapter on this topic, an excellent chapter of our handbook at that time. And so for about 10 years, Ethiopia was following, supporting agriculture, transforming agriculture, because that is a big wheel. If you don't try to move it, you cannot talk about manufacturing. 2002, 2003, development strategy, focused and attracting FDI was part of that. And Ethiopia introduced the most activist industrial policy to attract floriculture sector investors. And this was done in a highly concerted effort. And in this sector, it's over 50% are Dutch. The biggest flower company in the world, Share Ethiopia, which had employed 15,000, is from Holland. And this sector in 5 years created 200,000 jobs and over 250 million US dollars export. So in floriculture, entirely European. Then when we look at, for instance, aviation, we know the story of Ethiopian Airlines, which is the biggest aircraft. It's an instrument of industrial policy. The whole experience was taken from the Americans. Ethiopian Airlines was established with the support of TWA, a US aviation company, which has now gone bankrupt and merged with other airlines. When we look at brewery industry, Ethiopia has the fastest growing brewery industry. I'm referring beer. We are drinkers of beer and we are drinkers of coffee. 75% of coffee we produce, the base coffee, is consumed locally. So they are entirely European. Malt barley, European. When we look at light manufacturing, then we have the Chinese. Not only Chinese, but also from Sri Lanka, from Indonesia, mainly Asian manufacturers. So it's important to bear in mind, Ethiopia's approach has always been very pragmatic. If we pick textile and apparel, the first question we raise is, where is the origin of the best companies in that industry? So in textile, Turkish were investing, Chinese were investing, Indian were investing. So I want to highlight this. Second, in terms of park, this is the first park in Ethiopia, which was built 2010. We have to remember, African countries, many of them, Nigeria built 1980s. Senegal and Liberia built 1970s. EPZ of Mauritius, 1970. So Ethiopia is latecomer. Until 2010, Ethiopia did not have a single park. So this investment came. I know the owner. I was meeting him in my office every time. And Ethiopia did not have, despite the industrial policy, did not have any policy in relation to agglomeration or these industrial hubs, clusters. That was a missing part of our policy. So Eastern Industrial Zone, they faced a lot of difficulties, because the policy doesn't exist. But the gentleman has been quite firm and very strong, and he has maintained for almost 15, 16 years, despite many difficulties. But then The approach we adopted was in 2013. We reviewed and we said, we cannot talk about industrial park, about industrial zone. We don't have a policy. So we're very honest to say, we don't have policy. The first thing we need to do is let's develop the strategy. And we didn't want to copy Chinese model. Chinese model is different. We wanted to look at experiences from different countries. The most successful industrial parks are in China. From nearly all industrial hubs globally, 70, 80% are in China and very successful. But the political system, the structure of the economy is different. The experience is different. So we say we look from Africa to focus on 2 countries to study, Mauritius and Nigeria. Nigeria, not successful model, and Mauritius, a successful model. From Asia, we took China, we took Singapore, we took South Korea, Vietnam, and on document review, mainly Taiwan as well. And we did the study not by consultant. We did it from the Office of the Prime Minister, was the entire study conducted. I led the research, we had a big team, and we had to go physically to understand. When we had to go to China, we requested, we want to study, and we clearly said, if we want to study, we don't want to do it the formal way. I'm a minister. As a minister, I have to be invited by protocol by a minister from China. Then it's going to be guided tour, and we are not going to pick all lessons. So Beijing was asked, and Beijing gave permission that we can do that, but I cannot use my diplomatic passport. I agreed to use my ordinary passport. And we covered, and the questions, we already have many, many questions. I'm raising this because if we have to think about policy learning, and it's quite important, then you need to have a very clear idea, a targeted, and end with questions. One of the questions we had was, the Chinese story will start. 1978, Deng Xiaoping had 4 pilot special economic zones. And they will tell you, Shenzhen became successful, a small fish village of 3,000. Now it's the Silicon of China. And this is true. But what we don't really hear much is, we don't hear much about the 3 other special economic zones piloted, which were not equally successful. And I was asking, what was the reason they didn't succeed? And I never got the correct comprehensive answer. Not because they were not willing to tell us. You don't find in English the literature. And the reason was those who were involved in the early days, early phase, because we were interested on the early phase. How do you start? Not rather how China is doing now, because the environment is different. And when those people who were involved there, at that time, it was not properly documented, in English at least, not available. And you don't find them because they have retired. Some of them have passed away. So we had to look for some person who was involved, and we found in Chongqing, one of the major cities with 30 million, he was a vice mayor. He was just retiring. So we had to go to him, and I stayed with him 1 full day, and he explained to us what the reasons were. So in every Singapore, Mauritius, we meet ministers, the private sector, the parks, Vietnam in a similar way. So the model we developed, the strategy, was a lesson taken from all processes. Then we had prepared white policy paper, discussed and approved, then the regulations and proclamations, and then institutional changes. We made fundamental shifts in 2014. So we came up with a new idea. So in Ethiopia, other than Eastern Industrial Zone, the new industrial parks development strategy, based on that, almost over 20 industrial parks have already been built. The first pilot industrial hub was Hawassa Industrial Park, which is sustainable, low carbon industrial park, which is specialized. In this park, you have heard, they have cement, they have metal, automotive, all industries. The model we adopted was to avoid enclave concept, to develop linkages, was specialized parks, and then one-stop service. So a key point is that in terms of policy, you need to consider this. Then I also want to remind you, as all of you here are academics and researchers, the way research are done are highly abstract. When you look at the real reality of industrialization, reality of transformation, it's quite messy. Actually, the evolution of capitalism is even violent, uneven, chaotic, never goes as planned. As you have seen, this really tells us the pain of transformation, the pain in families, the pain in husband, the wife. They don't have same perspectives, and their daughter. So it's the transformation process. When we look at abstract, we look at it as a very neat process. You develop policy, then you implement, and also when we research, why couldn't policymakers do like this one? But in reality, it's messy. And here you can see the political economy aspect as well. The mayor of that small city, Duncan, was mainly interested about a park, a fountain, so that he can call his bosses, then they will say, you have done a good job. He was not bothered at all about employment creation, about manufacturing, about exports. If this guy was fully supportive, the issues would have been solved 100%, because compensation has been given. Whether it's limited or not is another story. So this really shows us the political process, and it's part of the reality. Then I also want to tell you, this is a story of Duncan. This is a story of East Industrial Zone. But Ethiopia is a very, very diverse nation. And it's different in Hawassa and Hawassa Park. It's different in Adama. It's different in Dredawa. And everywhere is full of tensions and chaos. But again, it's quite varied. I should stop.
No, that's very good. Yeah. And I just actually want to follow up and actually just, you know, what was very interesting, of course, the way the mayor in Duncan was responding to, let's say, incentives from the top, and the way it is, you know, it reminded me, and I just wanted to actually ask about, to you, Arkebe, you know, how you were thinking evolving that. So one thing that I do remember, you mentioned Cher. I remember going to visit them in Zhuhai, and they were quite amazing. And I remember, you know, we go back then, must have been 2008 or 9 that I went to visit them. And we asked them, so these are the Dutch flower investors, sorry, I should be clear. And of course, you know, a cold chain getting flowers all the way flying into Holland, or at the time often they flew them in via Charleroi, Belgium, going to the Dutch market, a whole cold chain. It's all complicated. And infrastructure, of course, is not as you see Addis today, and it was all complicated. And I remember, and I asked, I said, well, how do you solve problems? And he said, well, I have the phone numbers of all the ministers on my phone. If I have a problem, I call. Now, move it forward about 10 years, and it was actually another Chinese shoe factory investor. I was talking to her, and and I asked her, so, you know, and she was a little bit in the same spirit here, complaining about everything, and saying, well, and I just asked her, don't you have the phone numbers of the ministers? Yeah, but it's always engaged. And this whole thing of how do you build an investment climate when you start small, you can help them, but you can't have a mobile phone investment climate forever. So, and it's clearly also, you know, that the mayor of Duncan can block something, clearly suggests somehow strategically something is not built up. So where do you think that's going? What was missing, or what one can learn about that? Yeah.
It's you know, part of the political system we have in Ethiopia is the federal system. So regions have their autonomy, and the central government also have responsibility in policy setting, and many of the programs are also guided by federal government. For instance, Ethiopia has been investing in infrastructure hugely. On average, capital formation in Ethiopia has been for the last 25 years. From year 2000, it was 30%. This is twice Africa's average. A poor country investing in energy, investing in infrastructure, primarily from domestic resources, not just external finance. So this is one key element which has a meaning in many of the projects. For instance, energy was a major part of incentive for many investors. Energy is available. I don't mean that it's free of any problems, but the cost is so low, and it's a conscious decision made. 3 US cents per kilowatt hour was the rate we promised all investors will be maintaining for 10 years. Because the question they ask is, if they are bringing a big textile mill, what is the energy cost? Okay, 3 US cents. Are you going to increase it next year? Because they are making long-term decisions. So in MOU, we'll agree for 10 years. And this is a fraction, 20% what they will find in Vietnam. But this is because the government had invested in hydropower significantly. Then the other element, many of the investors who came after 2014 had visited many African countries, among them Tanzania, Kenya. And this include the brands, PVH, H&M, all. They were looking to diversify their value chain, supply chain to Africa. And all of them saw the advantage of Egypt and, Kenya and Tanzania. They have ports. Ethiopia does not have a port. Despite that, they decided to invest in Ethiopia. And the main reason was they said the government is relatively, I'm talking relatively, corruption is not a major issue. We can have access to the policymakers, and that issues can be addressed quickly. So between 2012, we reformed a lot of investment processes. We restructured and we made a lot of reforms, including one-stop service, including targeted investment approach. And between 2012, the FDI inflow in Ethiopia was only 1.1 billion. 1.1 billion only maximum. It's quite significant, but that was the limit. With the new introduction, the approach to targeted approach is you identify sector, you identify firms, you put a lot of effort. And 2017, Ethiopia became the second destination of textile FDI globally, according to UNCTAD data, next to Vietnam. And the amount of FDI also increased from 1.1 to 4.3 billion in 4 years. It quadrupled. And here, industrial park is part of the story because they can come and Ethiopian Investment Commission waits them at airports, receives them. They can meet me the same day, even 9 p.m. at my office, or Sunday or Saturday, everyone was available. And then Ethiopian Airlines also is part of the story. They can come from Hong Kong, midnight, arrive morning, go to parks, and then return the same day. So it's a combination of all interventions. This made a difference to increase the movement. So Share Ethiopia, it was good that you raised. Share Ethiopia, the owner, is a very interesting guy. He has he has heart problem, and he's ill. But the way he manages his businesses, he's the biggest floriculture company in the world. He arrives every Monday to Addis Ababa, He goes directly to Zwei, where his farm is. Exactly after 2 weeks, he then go back to Holland, and then again he comes back after 2 weeks. Same day, same hour, same flight. Every time he comes to Addis, he comes to my office. And he comes to my office, he doesn't say, thank you, the government is doing this. No, he just will tell, there is always tension between Ethiopian Airlines, which carries their flour, and these flour companies. So he takes only 20 minutes. He tastes 4 or 5 problems. Again, I have to expect after 2 weeks, he will come up with another 4 or 5 problems. But the response he gets from us, from the policymakers, is we wanted to listen. We wanted to solve. And because of this has been a regular process that we're able to address many issues. Same thing with all the new brands, the textile hub companies that came as well. So a key issue is there must be a responsiveness. And some of the strategies we developed also have been influenced by investors. For instance, we had to revise the labor law. The labor law was traditionally followed by Mengistu's regime, which was entirely socialist command economy-based labor law. And this was unacceptable to many of those companies coming from Asia. We have to balance, of course, but revision was very important. And the way we did it is we told them, bring us the best experience in Asia. And we are ready to change based on these best benchmarks.
Very good. So just moving to Stefano, you've researched labor markets in quite a few places, but especially in Ethiopia. And so, what you saw here in terms of the experience of workers, how does that link to what you know from your research, from other research on labor markets? What's different? What are similarities? Could you just tell us a few things here? Yeah.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say it was a pleasure to watch this documentary. You were really drawing this contrast between data and human stories, but here I saw my data actually, coming to life. So it was a really nice experience. A lot of my experience is based on the Hawassa Industrial Park in the south of the country. Dr. Arkebe just told us there are some differences. There are also some similarities. So, but please bear that in mind when I speak. So what do I recognize from my own research in the documentary? I guess there is really this big tension that we see in the data, and that I think the documentary did a great job at illustrating, between two facts. Fact number one, there is a quote from the documentary that I wrote down. One of the workers said, "No one is happy working at this job." Fact number two is these jobs are actually in fairly high demand, and losing one of these jobs, it's terribly costly for the workers. So that tension is really what I want to talk about. So the first part of the tension, no one is happy working at these jobs. Well, for example, we know that these are high turnover jobs. So lots of the workers that join these jobs leave them quite quickly. There is this, in fact, quote at the beginning of the documentary by Betty. I felt really scared. It was my first job. There were hundreds of people. It was a very intimidating experience. Lots of workers just leave at that point. She's stuck to the job, but many workers leave. And we know the wages are really low. So, for example, in Hawassa, but I think this is true in other industrial parks as well, rather than workers making enough money to help their families back home, it's rather the contrary. Families back home send them a little bit of money to make ends meet. So I think this is quite common. Obviously, from the family back home's point, it's still a major advantage, because rather than supporting a full, their children fully, they just have to send a little bit, but it's still transfer going from families to workers rather than the other way around, which we would expect in other contexts. And in some of our data, then you see, then if you sum up this money that they're getting from the park and the money they get from their parents, their level of consumption expenditure is still only maybe 30-40% above extreme poverty. Above extreme poverty, but like not comfortably so. So budgets are very tight. At the same time, the jobs are in high demand, and losing one of these jobs can be very costly. So, for example, at the beginning of the documentary, Motto says, I can give you 50 workers, 100 workers overnight. And it is true that people that have worked in this environment do find that sourcing labor is sometimes is a problem depending on the season and whatnot, but often, but by and large, it isn't. So there is demand for these jobs. The striking workers eventually back down because they want to keep the job. And in the study that we've been working on the most lately, which we'll present, by the way, on Tuesday, my co-author François Gerard and will present it, and Lucas Hensel and Girum, the other two co-authors, are somewhere in the room. There we follow some of the workers in the SOAS industrial park. They were laid off after Ethiopia. We didn't reach the latest year, but a big shock to the industrial park strategy came when Ethiopia lost AGOA trade status. So some companies used AGOA trade status to be able to export to the US tariff-free. This was removed for a number of political reasons that probably this is not the right place to discuss, but this was removed in early 2022. And that meant that some factories, not all of them, some of them were exporting to Brazil, to the Middle East, to Europe, but those that were exporting to the US were really badly affected because tariffs went from almost zero to most favored nation tariffs. So overnight from 0 to something like 30%, depending on the goods. And we follow some of the workers that lose their jobs during this episode, and we can match them to workers that don't, because in the same industrial park, you have firms that are supplying Europe and firms that are supplying the US, and we do find major costs. So just to give you some data, about a year after the shock, they've lost about 60% of their labor income. So most of them remain unemployed for long periods of time. Consumption expenditure drops by about 15%. Extreme poverty doubles. Okay, so this is a real big welfare cost from the point of view of the workers. And finally, and then I'll move to what surprised me the most. But the last thing I want to say is something that is very striking is also that they, of course, search for another job very hard just after losing this. And most of them look for work in manufacturing and in the industrial park itself. Okay, and we asked them why. But the numbers are striking. So of 90% of those that find employment again, they do find employment in the manufacturing sector, 75% in the SOAS industrial park itself. So they're returning back to these jobs. And they say things like the hours were good. It was a convenient location. The environment, the work environment was better than my alternatives. Or things related to not knowing the urban economy. So, for example, I do not know how to find another job, and so on and so forth. These were the kind of things that we were getting, but some of them were pointing to some of the amenities that these jobs. So that's what really I thought your documentary aligned with our priors, because you were really showing these two sides. Nobody's happy at the job, yet everybody wants it. Contrast. The one thing or two things that surprised me quickly, if I have 2 more minutes, are you painted a very. I was teasing you that you were giving us the two sides on every topic. So on this you also gave us two sides, but my perception was more one-sided, perhaps. The way that you portrayed the relationship between Ethiopian and Chinese, I thought was quite interesting to me, because I would have heard lots of reports of the more negative sides, but you start with a wedding between an Ethiopian and Chinese, so it's really at the heart of your narrative how these two groups are relating in productive ways. So yes, so maybe later you can tell us a bit more about what your views are on that, because some of the reports in the press would talk about the Chinese discipline culture clashing with Ethiopian communitarian values and things like that, but you seem to have a much more nuanced view of that. That's one surprise. Second surprise, and I'll finish here, is the contrast between the huge economic opportunity involved in developing phase 2 and 80 farming livelihoods, which of course, these people are living on very low incomes, so we should be extremely protective of their welfare. But at the same time, from an economist perspective, it's shocking that there couldn't be an arrangement, even cutting the government out. 80 well-paid guard jobs provided by the Eastern Industrial Park Corporation, at least from my point of view, ought to have solved that problem. And I understand that if you are a guard for a big Chinese company, you lost your main assets, so you are more vulnerable. but you can make enough money available. You should be able to make enough money available to them upfront that it would be a no-brainer deal for them. So to me, it was quite shocking to see the contrast between those two things. And I'll stop here, but it was a real pleasure to see our data come to life.
That's very good. So excellent. So I'll get you a chance, Max, in a moment to come back to it. And I just wanted to add before I come to you, Pramila, it's just you know, and Arkebe, you mentioned earlier the transformation is messy and is the whole thing. You know, there's one thing that I'm someone who largely works on rural development. One thing that I really liked that what you showed, and it's actually my standard example also a little bit on terms of, these jobs are not very good in the industrial sector and they may be all difficult, but you showed very correctly what the alternative was this woman sitting all day long in dung, making dung cakes. And it's actually my standard example to my students say, yeah, it's there, but don't forget the alternative in the rural areas is sitting with your hands in dung cakes, in dung all day long, and that can't be good for you. And so if people say, including some of my research, these jobs were difficult, there may be some health issues for some of these jobs, and indeed they complained in the film a bit like, these are tough jobs. Never forget that alternative. That's I was very pleased with to see. But Pramila, if I may come to you, you know Ethiopia well, but you also studied, or you're studying migrants moving to these kind of factories also in India, and it's an interesting thing. You refer to Max, you refer to being inspired from the stories out of China. I just wonder, what can you add here, and what are you reminded of when you saw the film here?
Just checking.
Yeah,
right. Thanks, Stefan. So, as Stefano was explaining, the differences or the similarities, it's not madly different from the Indian context. And so let me start with what I think are real similarities with the picture that you presented. And the first thing I can think of is that there's a gap in expectations which really drives early exit out of these jobs. And as Stefano says, they might come back to it. But when they start, there's enormous turnover right at the start, and that's because workers are getting very imprecise signals about wages, about conditions, they're coming straight out of rural areas, perhaps. In the Indian context, that mightn't be exactly so. They often come through recruitment channels that are vocational institutes. So in principle, there's some minor amount of training they get before they are launched 1,500 miles across the country to a completely different state. But this gap in expectations simply means that in the first 3 months or thereabouts, turnover rates are very high for firms, which is something that they find difficult to manage, right? So it's expensive for firms, in some ways expensive for workers who have to go back. So I would imagine that's similar in both contexts, right? And the other thing is that firms can manage attendance, but not quit. So what I mean by that is, in your film, you had, the lack of punctuality, the likelihood that perhaps they're absent quite a lot, and so on. And in the Indian context, this has been solved a little bit like the Chinese did. I don't know if anyone's read the book Factory Girls, but that's something very similar that they've achieved in the Indian context, at least amongst formal firms, in building hostels. And so the young women from the rural areas who are recruited from relatively similar groups and so on arrive in the hostels. This might be the first time they've lived in that sort of very formal, very, crowded accommodation. But for the firms, it's worth investing in because they can rely on them to be there on time. They have little buses to take them to work and back. They can rely on them to offer overtime, which is very important when orders fluctuate a great deal. And that's what I wondered about in this particular context. It must be very difficult for firms to achieve that. So fluctuations in orders can't be smoothed quite as readily here. The other thing I thought was fascinating was, if you like, what I'd call cultural distance, which becomes rather vital, again, perhaps in both contexts. In your film, it was the distance, say, between the Chinese supervisor and the local worker, and the difficulties of communication, the fact that, you know, Ethiopians don't like direct orders, and the bit of shouting and all that sort of thing that goes with it. It's just madly impolite. And in the Indian context, they're moving 1,500 miles down south from the north. The north is poorer than the south. And and the same sort of things result, i.e. the supervisors are local. They speak a different language, in our context, Tamil. And the migrants are from the north, speaking completely different language. But more than that, there's also difficulties about food, about customs that simply don't translate. But what I wanted to say there is that what it effectively means that you have some sort of uncompensated non-monetary costs that raise the price of retention for these firms, that make it very difficult to keep them on. Another really important and very neat thing that you illustrated was the independence benefit to young women. And I like that very much. I think it's complicated. You leave home, it's unpleasant, unhappy job, as Stefano says. It's repetitive, it's tiring, there are health consequences. But somewhere along the line, the young women achieve a kind of independence. They have this network of friends and so on. Now, the difficulty is that that's not quite the same in the Indian context. In fact, so while I think the wages are low, but I think twice as high as in the Ethiopian context in this setting. So something like $50 was mentioned. These young women probably earn about $80 to $90 per month. They send money home, but often the recruiters open a bank account in the name of the parents, and the wage is paid directly to the parental account, which is obviously a very poor incentive to stay, and they don't stay. But to the extent that that doesn't quite happen, they attempt to save, but they're saving for marriage, and they last maybe a max of 18 months before they go home. So I suppose the kind of independence, side of things in the Indian context, we might want to think about harder. Does it actually liberate young women? It does do for 18 months, probably, but that's about it. But that I thought was fascinating in that film. Thank you.
No, that's great. Look, Max, why don't you reply a little bit with some commentary here, and then we'll go to the floor and then get your questions ready. So, yeah.
Sure. Thank you. I've been taking a few notes. So yeah, on your point about Chinese relations and this idea of opening with marriage, it is complex in that there is, we witness and we see in the film to some degree a lot of the frictions between the Chinese managers and the Ethiopian workers. In that particular factory that we featured the wedding from, they had 4 couples and it was usually a similar dynamic. It was a slightly older Chinese managerial level and usually a younger Ethiopian female worker. They had 4, they now have 2 children. I think two of the couples have had kids since then. That it was interesting, it's quite a specific thing, but that one factory, Haibor, had particularly, we noted better sorts of Chinese Ethiopian worker relations than we did in some of the other places. There was something about the culture they built there that just was more they were more assimilated, if that's the right word. But it wasn't a freak occurrence to see that a wedding at all. And there are a lot of interethnic couples. More widely on that question, I mean, there is, actually Weiwei, who's sitting over there, Weiwei Chen, did a lot of research on this one industrial park, and what she and the team at SOAS found was that there were significantly higher levels of, when they did comparative studies between Chinese employers and non-Chinese foreign employers or Ethiopian employers, is they found higher levels of verbal abuse from the Chinese managers, for example, than in some others. That was a kind of a running thing. So there's definitely those frictions that exist in a big way. Yeah. But I think there is also, I mean, Motto is kind of extraordinary. The director of the industrial park, she's been there for 14 years. She doesn't necessarily represent the standard profile of a Chinese Chinese managerial level person who's come to Ethiopia. She speaks Amharic, she speaks great English. So maybe she's not a unicorn, but she maybe doesn't represent the norm, I guess, in a sense. In your question about the land, I mean, this is one of the big things that we found equally as confusing as you, in the sense that this issue that it should be a relatively small investment and a relatively small problem solving for such a giant investment, and we found it very difficult to understand what was going on. But to explain the compensation situation, basically, the Chinese had paid the compensation to the government, and then there were three different types of compensation. There was compensation for farmland, which had been paid to all of the villagers whose land was being used for the second phase of the industrial park. Then there was 500 square meters of land in Duncan town, and that was the big, most contentious issue, basically, that every farmer whose land was being appropriated, they were entitled to 500 square meters of land in town on which to build a new house. And this was sort of part of this urbanization scheme. And then the third part of the compensation was for those farmers in the village who were also losing their house, their farmstead, which wasn't all of them, it was about half of them. They had to be compensated for the house, the trees, and livestock that they had living on there. So all of the land, the initial financial compensation for the land was paid. The big problem was the 500 square meters, and then when we asked the Duncan government about this, the answers were always completely, I mean, it was you could never, especially out of the mayor, you could never get a clear answer what was happening. But as we understood it, there was a parcel of farmland that had been designated to compensate the farmers from our village. But in order to free up that land, they had to remove another group of farmers who were on that farmland at the time, and they had to find land for them and compensate them. So I think there was a logistical problem that they found extremely difficult, and those farmers kept changing their minds about what they wanted to do with the land. They wouldn't accept the compensation. Then some of them teamed up with a company that they wanted to develop the land together and build a factory. It was extremely complicated, and basically they couldn't solve that. And then the last part, the money that should have been paid for the homesteads, because the farmers were still living on their houses, they said, well, we don't need to pay you because you're still living on it. It just became incredibly complicated. But I mean, I think you're absolutely right that that money had been paid by the Chinese, as I think Dr. Arkebe alluded to. The Chinese got that land for a very, very good price. I mean, and what happened as this thing increased over time, the cost of the land increased so dramatically, and the cost of living in general increased so dramatically for those farmers, that if you ask these people now to move to the city and build their own house with increased costs of construction, of food, of absolutely everything, they can no longer afford to do that on the original money that they were paid. So then the local government had gone back to the Chinese and said, we need more compensation. The Chinese said, we're not going to give you more compensation. We've already paid it. And because the whole thing dragged on, it just got worse and worse and worse. So, yeah, it's complicated. To your point on the factory workers and dormitories, it was interesting when we asked Chinese manufacturers about why don't you have dormitories, because that was what was really interesting when they had industrial parks and factories in general in China, was they built a sort of factory, dormitories were built into the factories. If you look at somewhere like Foxconn, they had tens of thousands of workers in one factory. They had dormitories, shops, recreation, cinemas, absolutely everything. And it created a whole factory cities and a whole factory culture around it, right? The Chinese factory owners that we spoke to said Ethiopian workers don't want to live in dormitories. And I'm sure it's a much more complex picture than that, and they probably didn't want to make the investment. But when you spoke to a worker like Betty, when we said to Betty, would you like to live in a dormitory? She said, no. And it relates to the independence to some degree. For her, the idea that, I didn't leave my parents in order to just be confined with a bunch of other girls in a room. Part of, maybe she was slightly more privileged than some of the other workers. I think her family was comparatively, they weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but she wasn't as poor as some of the other workers. And I think she felt more, she had her own little room within a courtyard and she didn't have to share. A lot of the other ones would be sharing. But I think the idea of being confined within a factory complex, in that kind of system does not appeal to a lot of the workers in a way that I think, for whatever reason, that's a whole other conversation, a lot of Chinese workers did. They were very pragmatic. They were like, if this will save me money, every single penny that I earn, I'm sending back to my kids in the countryside that I've left behind. And they were very happy to be in the dormitories. So, but it would solve a massive problem, because as you were talking about the wages, $50 a month sounds like nothing, but comparatively, it's not bad if compared to what you'd earn in a coffee shop. It's comparable, I think, to the wages being paid on the flower farms and that kind of thing. So it's not a terrible wage by local standards. But when the cost of living rises around you so dramatically and it doesn't change to meet that, then you have a big problem. And that was a big problem of why they can't save. If they could live for free or with rent control in a dormitory, it would make a lot of sense, right? What was my other thing? Independence benefit that you mentioned. I mean, that was a huge thing for Betty and her group of friends. But I think also, what I like about the way that the film turned out, or as we followed these different women, was the way that, for example, Wokinesh, the farmer's narrative, speaks to Betty's narrative. Because, when we talk about, and you mentioned the dung, there are these very, especially frankly with the Western European audiences, sometimes they have very romantic ideas about what the countryside is, right? And even our first editor, we edited the film in Denmark because the Danish government gives, they subsidize basically film post-production. So we used a Danish editor, and the Danish editor, who was a very nice man, but he wasn't very engaged with development world issues. And we thought that's great because we're trying to speak to an international audience who doesn't understand these things. We need to simplify. But he would say, I just don't know why you chose a farmer who thinks that industrialization is actually a good idea. Because we're trying to create a conflict. Each of these characters should be fighting with each other. It's all about conflict. And you think, well, our ancestors 200 years ago decided to leave the countryside and go into factories. Why did they do it? And I think when you look at, this is why it was important for Wokinesh, for us, that yes, it's complicated. She doesn't love the idea of working in a factory, but for her daughters, she was kidnapped into marriage. That is no longer legal in Ethiopia. But at the same time, she has that memory of this she lives within a patriarchal community, and she has the memory of literally being kidnapped into marriage. So why would you be so romantic about rural life, right? So I feel like industrialization represents something for these women that we're following. Anyway.
Excellent. Yeah. So we're going to go to the floor. I think we're going to get Professor Arkebe briefly to comment also on this labor workforce, because actually many of us in the research have come across that. And so how are you thinking about that?
Yeah. The first point I want to highlight is we expected, when we targeted investment to come and build the park was built plug-and-play system. Any factory can come, start production within 30 days. And recruitment was done also through the industrial park. So our understanding, the park's also location was based on population. The specialty textile apparel will be mainly where there is labor supply, like pharma in Addis Ababa, because of the professional working in there. So to give you an example, Hawassa Park, within a radius of 50 kilometers, it has a population of 5 million. Within a radius of 50 kilometers. And at Hawassa Park, we're struggling to create adequate employment. The target was 80,000. And recruitment started. And then we saw absenteeism, we saw retention issues. And it was quite scary. The investors could not understand. Some of them tried to introduce what they call the bonus system to make it competitive, which is common in Asia. And the workers were not willing. They were not incentivized by money. And when we go deeper, what we saw was, one is, which also Pramila raised, is the culture is completely different. In Asia, not just China, but all Asian countries. The common practice is a boss seniority is critical, and the factory shop floor supervisor can give with authority, can give instruction. In Ethiopian culture, that is unacceptable. This is because of our history. We are never colonized, and no one wants his respect to be undermined. So if the supervisors are angry, they leave the job. And this was common in all companies, Sri Lankan companies, Indonesian companies, companies from India, companies from China. And it was uniform. And not only that, even the other workers will strike when they observe this. So the key gap, which we also saw we could have, we learned from this process, a systematic introductory induction to the managers' supervision who come expatriates would have relatively helped. And also the workers need to understand gradually, because this is how capitalism works. It's not like negotiating as the ladies at Eastern Zone were trying to say 3,000, no, 5,000. That's not how capitalism works. So the culture was key point. On salary, the lesson we learned was salary is irrelevant. The reason is the cost of housing in almost all cities is above salary. Cost of food is above their salary. But what the factories can pay is based on the global market and their competitiveness, because labor is the key factor that they were able to come to Ethiopia. Labor and energy cost, and also market access. So on this, what we learned was absenteeism. We tried to study together with the companies. And when we studied, we observed pattern. The pattern of absenteeism was, the reason was, the workers will go, were absent on Friday, Saturday, or Saturday and Monday in some factories, not in other factories. Then we came up to understand those where there is low absenteeism was those companies who were providing canteens, who had canteens and who were providing meal for workers. And the absenteeism was in the companies who were not providing meal or who did not have canteens. So what the workers were doing is Friday they go to their family. They take bus, then they stay with their family Saturday and Sunday, then they come back on Sunday with food. They had to bring food from their family. So the firms, once we identified this, all agreed. All companies will provide canteen services, meals. And the meal was, in almost all companies, became quite a very decent food. Then also came the issue of housing. Housing, we have envisaged it, and the practice in China, the one in factories, we prohibited all companies. We don't allow you to have dormitories in factories. This will make it a prison. It's only a prison. You work there, you stay there over, you live there. This is unacceptable. It might have worked in China, but now even ILO does not accept it. Time has changed. So we put as a decision, government decision, at Eastern Zone, they have already done that. And we took measures on them and we gave instruction, we will not allow this because this is slavery. They have to have decent place to live. So on the housing program, different experiments were made. Later on, even we commissioned with support of funding from FCDO through McKinsey on how to address the housing issue. And the problem with the housing solution is unique. The workers are not going to live forever in these factories. So the workable model we found gradually is, we talk to the firms, the government will give you land freely near the industrial park, outside the industrial park, within walking distance. and at zero cost. Infrastructure also at zero cost will be presented. We want you to build a dormitory based on ILO standard, and they accepted. So in Addis Ababa, Shin Textile, a South Korean company, has built dormitories for 5,000 workers. Total, they have 7,000. At Hawassa, now the houses are being finalized at finishing stage for 6,500 workers. But the housing issue is a challenge. I have seen it a challenge in Vietnam. In every country, it's a major challenge. So you need to find a solution to that. Issue of welfare is critical, health, medicine, etc. Then I want to say a key point is the issue of this productivity. Training was given compulsory. Every shed has training package. But a key limitation is at shop floor also they were introducing different managerial intervention, including also payment systems based on output, which gradually the workers were quite happy with that. So by year 2019, for instance, in 3 years at Hawassa, retention dropped 5 to 10%. Absenteeism below 5%. And productivity, all companies were saying, we are now almost near Vietnam. And then COVID came. And this time, the factories have employed at Hawassa 35,000 workers. 35,000. Then COVID came. And the very interesting story is, during COVID, no employee, the government had to discuss with the firm owners. And the agreement reached was no worker would be laid off during COVID crisis. And the government also tried to give some incentives. Transportation, if when they export, they will be transporting freely with the railway system. And they were also told production should not stop, but the highest health control measures of COVID will be taken in the park. And it worked. No worker laid off. Then the government gave these companies to produce face masks for not only local, but for export. And Ethiopian Airlines arranged a special discount for materials needed for face mask. And the firms, and also with support from development partners, we arranged a 3 months salary subsidy to the firms because they were not exporting at that time. So what I want to say is, COVID-19, if the industrial parks were not there, the factories would have been closed, which had happened in many places in Asia. So this is an important story we need to understand. There is a literature, rich literature related with process of industrialization. I would encourage you to read work of Thompson, 1967. And it's in every country that has gone through this, it shows it's a protracted process. And this process is full of tensions, full of frustrations, and there is no other way. And lastly, I want to say the social transformation aspect was quite interesting. Those who were in the parks, they will go and study at evening schools. Almost all of them, I would say. And gradually they were saying they don't want to go back to their home. So they became independent, and the process, the social transformation aspect is so critical in industrialization. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's get a few rounds of questions. So let's take 4 questions. I see one here. I can guess any hands that go up. Yeah,
thank
please
you.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Ronald Isnaika from FCDO. So first off, Max, congratulations. I really, really enjoyed that. It reminded me actually a little of reading North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, which was written like 200 years ago. And it's basically the same story, but about industrialization in England. And one of the things from that book, from this, and actually from the panel, was the importance of like conflict resolution in all of this at various levels between workers and employers, between the firm and the local government, between the local government and the farmers. And I wonder if like part of the story here is that we just haven't invested or thought enough about all the different ways we could make that smoother, easier. It speaks a little bit to your question about Keynesian bargaining. Why didn't it happen? And I feel like there was very few forums where people could actually talk to each other. And I was wondering if that was, like, if anyone from the panel had any thoughts on that.
Very good. Any other questions coming up? Oh, people are very shy. Oh no, there's some hands coming here. I'll be here and then we go behind here. Yeah, here in front. Yeah, and then we'll go there.
Thank you very much. A very interesting film and very enlightening discussions. Maybe Max, as well as Arkebe, you can say the following. From the film, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't see a lot about consultation between communities. Rather, there is some form of strong relationship between the company itself and the private sector and the government. That is one. And the second one is any observations on water supply and energy supply and electricity. That was not also reflected. If you say something on that, will be good.
Okay, please.
Yeah, first, Max, congrats on a great film. I saw it for a third time today because it's very popular at LSC. But I guess I wanted to ask about, you already touched upon kind of the fact that because these parks are isolated from the environment around them, it makes it easier for the investors to come in, get everything done and then leave. And I wanted to ask if there's any trade-off when it comes to urbanization. What's the effect on agglomeration economies? If that's something that, for example, doesn't happen with these parks because they're a bit more isolated, and if it's in any way related to like overcrowding in cities and any urbanization-related issues.
Very good. And there seems to be one there further at the back. Oh, yeah. Well, let's take Jonas, and then the next round we come to you, sir.
Thank you very much. A great film documentary and also great discussion. What I wanted to ask is directly to Professor Arkebe. You were in charge of this process, and there were so many grievances actually by the farmer sides, and that's what resulted in the Oromo movement and also the whole sort of change in the political landscape in the country. I don't want you to go into the politics, but what are the lessons learned? What could we have done better actually, and what did we learn from that process? It would be nice to hear.
Very good. Okay, so Max, do you want to take anything?
Sure. Yeah. So the first question was forums where discussion can happen. I think that's a very astute point from what we observed is there weren't that many forums where it could happen. I think it felt like there was a much more top-down thing that people from the local government, if you're talking about the local government and the farmers, for example, the local government would organize. There were mechanisms. You saw a meeting in the film between a village representative who and the farmers, who then feeds back to the local government. But it didn't feel like meaningful consultation about what the villagers' needs actually were. It was interesting when we screened the film in Addis Ababa. Moto was one of the was up on stage for the Q&A, and when she talking about the tree, which is obviously extremely important to many in that, not everybody, but many people in the local community, and she said, when I saw the tree, it made me realize, it made me think of effective communication, and like if only we'd known the tree was there, that we would make all efforts to protect that tree. And the reality is they absolutely, they do know that tree is there, and if they went and spoke and had meaningful conversations with the community about what they really wanted, what was most important to them, then they would find some way to, I mean, it's not easy to move a tree, but it's possible, but to think about ways around that rather than sort of just building on top of not just the land, but also these people's shared cultural history, right? So I think that, I agree with you. I think that's really important. And while it's not that there are no spaces for communication, but perhaps there's not really a sort of infrastructure where it's not built into the process in a way that it should be, where it has to happen, I guess. Is that, I hope that's accurate. That was my impression. That was about consultation with communities. Yeah, water supply and energy. The local government, that was one of the things we saw, that you see at one point the villagers getting water from a well the well was provided by the Chinese industrial park. So it's actually one of the things where the local government, because the industrial park is so huge and they have their own generator, they have their own water system, the local government ends up leaning on the industrial park to provide some of those things. But the villagers complain bitterly, specifically about electricity, because you notice, I don't know if you can see it in the drone shots. They have these huge pylons going over the top of their village, but most of them don't have any electricity. And it's sort of quite an interesting symbol of that. And I think I can't remember exactly, and then I think that was also something that the local government were hoping that the Chinese would provide electricity out from the industrial park, but I can't actually remember who they kind of laid the responsibility fully on for why that wasn't there. But it was an interesting symbol of, you know, the infrastructure is right there on top of you, but none of it's actually going to you, as a kind of symbol of, yes, you know, it's maybe the rural community aren't benefiting in the way that they should be. Next, I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to any of that. Arkebe would know more. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I think on the land issue, it was addressed to me. Land becomes critical in rapid industrialization and transformation process. I'm not only thinking about industrial park. You want to build a road, and the road has to connect the rural areas. And you have to go through all farmers' land. Then the challenge becomes compensation is by law accepted, but the rate of compensation is quite variable. The government will always be, in some projects, the cost of compensation is bigger than the cost of infrastructure. So there is always from the government side to reduce the compensation burden, which means that more money can be utilized to develop the infrastructure. Same thing if you want to build schools or clinics. So land becomes a critical element. And we have to remember, I don't think it's only about fairness. For the farmers, land is their identity. If you ask them, I will give you a job that you'll be paid $100 in the future, or you take the land, because their understanding is limited and based on their past, they will usually choose this one. But on the land issue, some of the solutions made were, for instance, industrial parks. An arrangement was made by law that no investor or developer will get land directly by negotiating from farmers, because it will be very chaotic and corruption will be a major issue. So the arrangement now is, before any developer comes, for developer there is good incentive given. If a foreigner developer or local comes, goes to IPDC, the government agency, which has land bank, and from the land bank, all compensation is given by the government, settled, and then the developer will get the land only from the government agency. On floriculture also was a major issue in Oromia region. So in Oromia region, where the land was owned by the government previously, like those in Zuwai, it was not an issue. But when there is under farmers' ownership, it always has been quite contentious, quite difficult, quite complicated. And the local administration also sometimes do not play positive role. There are many elements in the process linked with corruption as well. So I believe land is a major issue. It's also like in India, the reason that you can never build a road in 3 years is you have to take ages clearing land is a very difficult, a very tough job. So I will say we haven't found a good solution to that, but there is political prices to be bear in this process. One positive experience, for instance, at Hawassa was, and on the other places, for instance, in Amhara and Tigray, during the industrial parks development, land was not a major issue. The administration was inviting, even requesting parks to be developed, and they were covering all the compensation by their regions. In Hawassa, an innovative solution that was introduced was, and it became a guideline all is, if there are 100 farmers to be relocated, because it's going to be relocated, they have to be given alternative land. They are allowed, not only allowed, they get priority factory jobs, 100%. They can also establish small firms like cleaning or gardening companies. And in all parks, fire brigades were basically organized, and the fire brigade will hire primarily these people. And in Hawassa, there were 90 which were relocated within the city. The houses were built, covered by the government, and given to those who were located. So in some places, we say good practice. In some places, not much. It also depends among the variation among the different regional states also matter a lot.
I just wanted to add that in India, in contrast to the tree that was already there and you'd have to worry about it, in India, I think they would actually fix a tree or a temple in the way in order to obtain compensation. So they'd work at it very differently.
There was a, yeah, so there's one there
Just
behind.
we missed one question, although I don't know if I have a good answer for it. Sorry. This gentleman's question here about whether the form of the industrial park and having factories all within one contained space affected urbanization. I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but one thing I would say is I'm not sure my experience of what you see sometimes when there isn't a very contained structure like this is that factory building can be quite haphazard. And it, you end up often with, and I saw this, a lot in China where it happened quite quickly, and then you'd have sort of a factory abutting, half a village would be moved, and then you'd have a few little farmhouses wedged between two factories, and then because obviously an advantage of an industrial park is also that you have a lot of centralized sewage, water treatment, that kind of thing. I think I would imagine, Dr. Arkebe will know much more, that doing it within an industrial park in a sense would probably be beneficial. But in terms of what it does to the sort of urban landscape, I guess it's complicated.
So look, let's take, in the interest of time, we're going to actually take, there's a question here and then these two questions. Yes, we can take the third one there, so yes.
So I want to circle back to the industrial policy, the working conditions within the industry and the park. So precisely on given the working hours, right? I kind of want to know maybe there is some provisions for healthcare. That's another thing that could eat into their small salaries. So I want to kind of know the provisions from the angle of policymaker and the conditions on ground on that.
Very good. We have here and then we have one there, and that's the last ones for now.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion and the movie too. Congratulations. One question to Professor Arkebe. Land belongs to public, to states, and it's not privatized. And of course, there's no active land markets. So that raises a question of compensation, how the land compensation rate is calculated in the absence of land price. That's one. Can privatization of the land be a solution than what we see now? Two,
you'll have to be very quick.
Just okay, all right, just one more. I see kind of some institutional gap. I didn't see the role of court in resolving the conflict between different parties.
Okay, very good.
And also, okay, it's fine. All right.
And we have quick one there. Yeah.
So wonderful movie. My question: there's a dominant theme in the movie about the pain of development. Motto especially, I think, encapsulates that. And I think a lot of Asian economies have developed on this idea of sacrificing generations, right? I just wonder if we agree, does development have to be so painful? Does only quick development have to be so painful? And is there a way for Africa to maintain what it does so well around community building and other things that we can keep and develop.
Okay, very good. I'm going to give you and Dr. Arkebe briefly, we don't have that much time, so a brief answer.
Should I answer the last
Yeah,
last question? I totally agree with you, and I think when we use Motto's line, which is a direct quote, it's two separate quotes from Deng Xiaoping, that development is the one truth, and then if you fall behind, you get trampled on, and it's sort of a justification for this model of development. I know what we witnessed in China was really brutal. I mean, often brutal. The outcomes, I think in many ways, I don't think they justify the brutality, but they also, 800 million people out of absolute poverty. I mean, it speaks for itself, but it was brutal. And I think in many times it didn't have to be brutal. And a lot of that is about doing it better, which is obvious. I think that now there are ways that Africa can do it in a way that wasn't as brutal as it was done in China, for example. And I think if you take the impact on the environment, for example, now there's low cost green energy in a way that there wasn't a previous generation. There's no way that somewhere like Ethiopia can't industrialize in a much greener way than previous generations because that technology is now available. In terms of your question, your point about speed, yeah, I think if you try and do anything so fast, you're not giving yourself time. It's not just about time, but time is important. If you look at what you're trying to do here and urbanize this rural community and just make them factory workers overnight and turn them from from farmers into urban residents overnight, it is brutal, and you need to give people time to transition from one to the other. They may not have a choice in this transition, but you have to try and make it as bearable for them as possible. I don't think it has to be so brutal, or we should just sort of accept that as a reality of industrialization. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, on the last point, I don't think the transition in industrial transformation, there is a way which is brutal. The process is brutal because it's transformation of social transformation, economic transformation. So without sacrifice, at least we have not seen in history in the last 300 years how capitalism has been functioning. That's the only point I say. But a lot could be done. A policy learning element is critical. The Chinese, one of the things they do is piloting. They pilot on a single project or few projects, they take lessons, and then they scale up to do it in the most effective way. That is absent in many African government policies, and that could help. On the other point, on privatization of land, I think this is brings us to another big issue. But if you ask me my personal opinion, I don't think privatization of land can address the issue of compensation. Then lastly, in terms of the welfare of workers, my understanding is, for instance, if government gives incentive to investors, I would argue the government would have, looking at manufacturing industrialization, an important direction. At early stage, it's important for African governments to provide some incentives to workers. This could be in different forms, like reducing their, let's say, income tax level for some years, housing, rent taxes. There are many areas intervention can be made. Then welfare, we have to bear in mind meal is quite important. One of the challenge, like Ethiopia, many African countries, is food inflation is high. Housing is expensive. And in general, inflation is relatively higher. So there should be a combination of welfare intervention that is covered by the firms and also partly by the government. This is important for transition.
Stefano?
Do you want Stefano wants
Okay,
to-
I'll just take one more. This was super interesting. It feels like we need another hour, but we've got 30 seconds. One thing that I want to, two things that I want to stress super quickly. One is there is a structural problem that comes from the fact that although putting all these firms in a park has all these benefits in terms of coordination and the environment and so on and so forth, it does create substantially local monopolies. So the firms then have a lot of power on these workers. And that's why then you have to struggle to, think of minimum wages or other welfare interventions and so on and so forth. They effectively are in an environment where, they can get as many workers as they want at those low prices. So they have no real reason. So that's one thing. And I know, in fact, Hawass Industrial Park is piloting a minimum wage scheme just in the next couple of months. So there will be movement here. But I guess you need some action like the floor set by the minimum wage to counterbalance that power. That's one thing. In terms of how to make compensation nicer, because of course there is a limit to how much you can push up wages, given that that's the reason why low wages is the main reason why those firms are there in the first place. I want to go back to the point on education. It is striking in our data, and it did come up in the panel as well, that many of these workers are studying at night. When we give them additional funds, some of them do spend it in education. So it seems, and they also don't want to be in industrial work for the rest of their lives. They think of it as a stage, 5 years, 6 years. They establish themselves in the urban economy, they move on. But in order to move on, they need education. Betty in your documentary did precisely that. So I suspect that the one area where the government can add most value is in making education pathways cheaper and more rewarding and more and give them more opportunities through that rampway of education. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to not do a big closure, but I just want to do three thoughts that came up in lots of the questions here, and I just three quick ones. Is that, I do take away, and whether it has to be brutal or not, it will definitely be a massive change. These transformations are there, and it's a really interesting point. Is that, Ethiopia was doing that in a period of indeed trying to push really rapid change. But let's not forget there is an incredibly impatient population, young population waiting for it. So I'm afraid that I agree with you but we should be willing to accept, because the alternative is that let's not grow too fast and let's keep it all a bit slow. So there's a real tension. But look, it's that's fascinating. Interesting on land, and we heard your view as well, and it's an interesting thing because many of us would say, well, slightly better defined property rights would do a great deal of good, but probably what I take away from years in Ethiopia, including studying on land, from where you are to go to there, it's a very complicated route. Because you are somewhere, and at the moment, constitutionally, the state owns the land. People have users' rights, some rights that are not always well defined. So whose land is it anyway? And is the kind of the complication there anyway, if you go for these schemes, what you probably alluded to with the compensation. And then finally, it's an interesting thing. We were involved at some point in a study, both in China and in Africa, on industrial parks. And it was a very simple data set from the World Bank about the location of industrial parks. And what was interesting about that data set was that the distance to urban centers of industrial parks in Africa was far, far, far more than the distance in China. Now it was quite messy, and there's probably there maybe a time-like issue and whatever kind of thing. But I do remember in China talking to officials when we talked about urbanization, industrialization, say, yeah, the only way what we've learned, if it to be successful, it has to be two sides of the same coin. And so thinking about it, and that's the kind of thing, we may be tempted to go for industrial parks because we can create an environment where we can be perfect service to the firms. But to have the massive externalities on it in the community, we probably need to think about location. And definitely, that was striking. The distances in Africa were massive between where the urban centers were and the industrial park. Yeah.
On the a key criteria in the selection of locations in Ethiopia has been all these parks are located, and we have used the criteria. Each city should have its own international airport and all have international airport. There should be university, and all the parks are located where there is 1 or 2 universities, and also where there is dry ports or some logistical benefits. So the criteria are so important, and what I have seen is, if you want to avoid being enclave, and you have to include clustering, tie it to urban agglomeration, the spillover effect, they have to be within the city.
Very good. Look, there's some drinks waiting for us. I'm going to just want to thank Max for a great film and his entire crew. Professor Arkebe, thank you so much also for coming and enlightening us, and my fellow colleagues, Pramila, Stefano. Thank you very much. They deserve an applause.